what they weren't doing in community development issues. In Detroit, it's very easy to find those kinds of stories. But I wanted to say a couple words more about intermediaries. These are these institutions between funders, federal funds, and other resources like training resources and all, and the nonprofits, the many small nonprofits at the grassroots level. And in Cleveland, the dominant intermediaries are locally controlled and locally formed, and they have remarkable programs of training for nonprofit developers and the nonprofit leaders, and they have established much larger funding streams, stable funding streams to those nonprofit developers. In Detroit, the only intermediary is a branch of the national LISC, which Cleveland also has had, but it's really Cleveland's local intermediaries that have transformed the industry there. The Cleveland Housing Network is a large-scale affordable housing developer that develops housing on behalf of the small CDCs, so spreads the risk and has been doing $60 million a year of housing development. So what does all this mean? It means that as we focus on how can we deal with this state's cities, which are so many of them have faced this huge population loss and abandonment, we can derive a lot of lessons ultimately from the different successes of different cities and different kinds of handling of abandoned property to enable people to make something new of it, and from other states which have also, where their cities also have experienced this, which are really the states from New York through Wisconsin and down through Missouri. So I can't have a presentation without saying thank you to many people, because all my work and my students' work depends on grants that we receive from many places, and I have had so many students working on these projects. That's a positive reuse of a vacant lot in the Heidelberg project in Detroit. So now we're ready to take, the three of us are all ready to take any questions, comments you have. Yes?
I'm just curious at your discussion of the auction. I guess maybe I misunderstood the point of some of the land banking stuff, but I thought that was to insert themselves between acquisition and going to auction to avoid some of the speculation. What was your number?
The process is, in this state, is the property is foreclosed. It's in the ownership of in the hands of the county treasurer, and then the treasurer has to offer the property at auction. Then any property not sold can go to a land bank. It's in Genesee County. It's there are various tactics to try to keep people from being interested in buying property at an auction, and that's bundling large amounts of property where you don't know what's in the bundle really, and you don't know how many demo liens there are that you would need to pay, and the price is very high, and so people tend not to bid on that bundle, and then that goes into the land bank. But there's always that auction in between.
Is speculation still a concern?
Oh, very much, yeah.
I was hearing much more of an interest in getting it out to the market quicker. Description as opposed to less.
Yes, it's not a matter of quicker, it's a matter of much more measured and careful, because enabling, for instance, nonprofits to look at what the property is, find out its condition, and get financing. You have to come in with a cashier's check within 24 hours of the auction to get the property. Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Thomas. You talked about Richard Florida's work and mentioned briefly the creative class. What role do you think that plays in Michigan going forward?
Well, there was a period when Richard Florida was had basically a consulting firm that was advising the Cool Cities team. And so there was some imprint of his theories, creative class theories, on the state. The Tide, for example, borrows a lot, the talent, innovation, diversity, environment. But I think that wisely, Michigan chose not to identify itself too closely with Florida's concepts, because at the time he was advising the state team that was working on Cool Cities, there really hadn't been a lot of independent scholarly validation of his research. And it's taken 3 or 4 years to get those studies done, and the studies that we have suggest that some of his theories make sense and some of them can't be, some of his calculations can't be duplicated. His findings can't be duplicated all the time. And so there is some feeling that the idea of the creative class is really better served by looking at educational levels than by looking at his specific definition of creative class. So I think he's still very popular. I think if you want him to come speak and you have, I don't know, what's he charging now, 50,000? Whatever, I mean, I'm sure he would come and tell you what to do. But I think that Michigan has not fully bought into that with good reason, and it turned out to be a wise decision.
Yes.
I'd like to go back to the original premise that you commented on earlier in the very first presentation, that the city is, again, the important ingredient. That being the case, one of the things that raises the question in my mind, if that in fact is true, and I don't disagree, I have not seen yet anything that would say what does a core city need or require to become a core city in terms of revitalization, et cetera. Okay? And that being the case, say, for the city of Detroit, what is going to be required to make that city a city, a leading city, in terms of economic, in terms of residential, in terms of recreational, and in terms of farming, if that, I've heard some people talk about farming. So my point is that, it's one thing to talk about different little pieces that's occurring, and I'm not being critical, I'm just raising the question. But what is the defined, in other words, what's the master plan? What is the master plan? And in that master plan, what are the components to get there? Yes.
Well, a master plan is very much needed for cities like Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, many others. But there are numerous components we know it should have. One is that we need to have focus on areas that can be strengthened and saved. And that doesn't mean well-off places. It means the places that are still fairly intact. It means putting the limited resources we have in targeted areas. Right now in Detroit there's a lot of discussion about that, but a lot of disagreement, and so it's not clear what will happen. It will probably mean that in order for the city's budget to be balanced ultimately, that services and infrastructure need to be withdrawn from nearly empty areas of the city where people are essentially living in a rural setting again. It means that we have to find a new economic base. The people are leaving in part because they can't get jobs. Many of my students love the city of Detroit. They want to stay here in this state. They can't because of jobs. And so this is a long-term effort of trying to figure out what is it that will replace our old manufacturing. And that isn't going to happen in the next few years, but over time. And we need a great deal more effort to discourage sprawling development and to pull in development so that there's more reason, so that people choose to live more centrally. We see a little bit of that happening in the